Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Mike Nelson, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. You are our new co-host, and I'm very excited about this.
It's unbelievable. I'm really excited to be doing this with you, Peter.
It's we're excited and a little bit disappointed at the same time because our editor Tanya Gans is leaving Corwin to pursue some other areas, and we're very proud of her for that. But we're also a little bit bummed because we absolutely love working with her. And when she told us, she emailed me and said, I think Mike Nelson should be your new co-host. So no pressure for you whatsoever.
Such huge shoes to fill, Peter. It's unbelievable to me. I'm honored by Tanya's outreach to ask me to do this. I'm a big fan. You had the privilege. I'm jealous of you because she's been your editor for a few books, and I just have had her for one. And my wife listens in the background sometimes when Tanya's in the meeting, and she's like, she's really smart.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, she is. I feel so blessed to have had her as an editor.
Yeah. So we're going to do this a little bit differently. Listeners who have been listening to Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast is going to see that this is a little bit different this time because Tanya and I used to do the intro and outro, and she was the producer on the background. But you and I are going to do the intro and outro, but we're also co-hosts. We're actually interviewing our guests together. And this guest is somebody I have had the pleasure to talk to before, and it is always amazing and engaging and powerful. But yeah, Tyrone Howard is our guest for today's podcast.
Yeah, and I feel like just reading Tyrone's work and things, I feel like he's my new best friend. So Tyrone Howard is a professor of education in the School of Education at UCLA. Professor Howard research expertise is one of educational access and opportunity, racial justice, and social belonging. He's currently the president of American Educational Research Association. His new book, Equity Now, addresses the whole school transformation to assist education leaders and practitioners more just in belonging schools. And, we have a great opportunity before us, and I think our listeners are going to just be amazed by him.
Talking to Tyrone, I felt like you just strap on your seatbelt because you ask questions, and for me, the whole interview flew by. With the listeners, do you think is there one area in particular? I know you're going to love the whole thing, Mike, but is there one area in particular that you honed in on that you think the listeners will really have something, it will resonate for our listeners?
I guess what I would encourage our listeners is more of a theme, Peter, than an exact, essence of the interview. And you and I often use this phrase, but I felt like he has had a lot of learning in his career, and this book encapsulates some of the things that he's learned. He'll talk about, like, at first I was like just pushing things, and now he's saying in order to shift a big cultural or to have a big cultural shift, he kind of uses, we need to lean into these conversations. We need to lean in. We need to have these critical kinds of conversations. And so, as our listeners view this, I would just encourage them to lean into his words.
Very well said. All right, so listeners, we know you are going to enjoy this conversation with Tyrone Howard.
Did you know Corwin provides Visible Learning Plus workshops led by some of the biggest thought leaders in education? Discover strategies from John Hattie, Fisher and Fry, and more as they share evidence-based solutions for immediate impact in your classroom. Get started at corwin.com today.
Tyrone Howard, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It is really good to see you again. How are things?
Things are well. Things are busy. Things are good. I can't complain. How have you been?
Things are going well. I want to thank you because as we're recording this podcast, it's 6 o'clock in the morning for you, as it is for our new co-host, Mike Nelson. So you both are up really early for this. So I appreciate you both for doing that.
No, glad to do it. I'm an early riser anyway. So thank you and Mike for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so let's jump in. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And so in Equity Now, you emphasize the urgent need for action in dismantling systemic barriers in education. Could you share an example of one or two of these barriers that you find most critical to address immediately?
Yeah, I think there's so many, but obviously the book was really generated in my mind from what happened in the aftermath of the pandemic. And what we saw was like tremendous opportunities to learn for poor kids and kids of color. And so like one of the biggest barriers that even post-pandemic we're still facing is access to high-powered technology. School, like the rest of society, is becoming very much a technology-driven domain. And there are still schools and still students out there who can't access class websites, who can't access materials, who can't access learning content because it's in an online format. We still have massive gaps in terms of who has access to technology, not only hotspots, but even different devices that can allow them. So just the opportunity to learn is, I think, one of the biggest barriers that we see. I would also add, and I talk about this in the book, that we also are still struggling with having equitable access to highly qualified and highly trained teachers. What we continue to see is that the kids who are in the greatest need academically, socially, and emotionally tend to get the teachers who are least qualified, least experienced, and who are oftentimes more likely to be overwhelmed. So again, you have brand new teachers, uncertified teachers, uncredentialed teachers teaching in high need schools with kids who are already behind. It just poses tremendous barriers in terms of helping those students who are already behind, who have fallen farther behind. It makes it even more daunting in terms of what we might be looking at in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that just for a minute because you just triggered a thought for me, which I mean, during the pandemic, there's a school district that I work with in California, high poverty, and they had to have the county buses come in because buses have Wi-Fi, and they would go to different spots within the neighborhoods just so kids could have access to Wi-Fi for an hour or two. And leading up to that, kids were, being sent home with packets.
hmm
So
hmm
I definitely would like to. I know Mike has a question for you. I'd like to definitely get back to the teacher issue as well.
hmm
No, Tyrone, I just really appreciate. Um, I'm a person, former superintendent in a school district in Washington State, and as a leader in trying to make cultural shifts just within a school district is a daunting task enough. But the cultural shift that you're suggesting in the book. For all of us across the world is even more daunting, and you need those anchors to hook onto in
Yep.
order and to tell your story in order to do that. And so yours is one of the first book post pandemic that tells a story that's been there, but now with a new understanding that we all went through. And I think it's going to resonate incredibly well. So thank you for that. The other thing I want to add before asking my question is I follow you on Twitter, and I love the joy and reaction that you had when you opened the box with your new books. And
Thanks.
good for you. It
Thanks.
does bring
Thanks.
you joy, and so
Thanks.
I
It
want to
does. It does.
congratulate.
It does.
Uh,
Thanks a
you
lot.
you share the story of equity, and um, oftentimes I think as educators we've seen the fence where kids are on different levels and looking peering over, but you
hmm
describe it uh, in 100-yard dash. So that I'm doing that as the set into my question. So your book proposes an equity framework grounded in justice, repair, and belonging. Can you elaborate a little bit on the framework and how it can transform school communities, particularly in terms of policies and practices?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mike. So I think for me, um, I think equity is one of these terms that's bandied about, becomes part of educational jargon. You ask 10 people what it means, you get 10 different definitions. And even if we describe it, actually what it looks like is something completely different altogether. And I think that there's a gap between the theory and the practice. And that's what I hope to do in this book is bridge the gap between what we conceptually understand equity to mean and what it means in real time in classrooms and in schools. So these three pillars that you mentioned around justice, repair, and belonging are really what I tried to kind of use to kind of ground my definition and understanding of equity. And the justice piece of it is really rooted in something that's just about how do we do what's right. And I think when it comes to schools, I think we could all agree that what the right thing that we should all be doing, and I think why we enter into this profession, is how do we do right by young people? How do we do right by students, no matter what zip code they come from, no matter what their first language might be, no matter what their abilities are at the time? How do we just do right? How do we always put students first? Plain and simple. There's so much politicizing of education nowadays. I think that the justice is if we recognize there are students who are woefully behind, we've got to put in sort of efforts and interventions to help catch those kids up. If we recognize there are students who have mental health challenges and concerns, where are resources around school psychologists and social workers who can help those young people who have social emotional challenges? So justice is about just doing the right thing. And I think that if we ask what the right thing is, most of us can probably reasonably agree on what those things are when it comes to students. So justice, this idea of doing what's right. The repair tenet is really rooted in this idea of recognizing past harms. And this comes to the 100-yard dash analogy I use. That we frequently say that we live in a meritocracy, and that where you end up in life is based off of where you sort of put your effort and your merit. And I push back on that mantra because I want to have us understand that the very groups who are behind today in schools are the same groups who have been behind for centuries in this country when it comes to educational opportunity. So we have to recognize that the denial of indigenous population to education is a big factor. We have to recognize that segregated schools did significant harm to Black and Latino students. We have to recognize that young people who have grown up in rural poverty and sort of impacted areas are still struggling in schools to this day. So the whole idea of recognizing past harm, some of which were legislated in this country to keep certain students from having access to high quality education. We just have to acknowledge that because it's a part of why we are where we are today. And I think then that third tenet is about how do we then create belonging schools? How do parents and caregivers feel like they have a place at the table when it comes to schools? How do we ensure that we're talking to leaders so that leaders feel like they have a vital stake in terms of how we think about school policy and practices? How do we make sure that, everything we do in terms of school boards and book bans, that we're asking everybody who is left out of this conversation and how do we bring them in? This is about not pushing people out. It's about bringing people together to make sure that we're all working toward the same common goal, which goes back to that first tenet which means doing right by young people.
I have to say, there's just so much swirling around in my head right now, Tyrone, as there usually is when I talk to you. You mentioned the idea of students being behind, and earlier on in the conversation, you were also talking about why is it that these are the schools that happen to also have the student or the teachers who are most unprepared. And I see that. I see that all the time. We've got, you know, I see examples of the kids who are the neediest as far as literacy goes are the ones that are put on a computer as opposed to, a high quality teacher that's sitting next to them. And when I think about the fact that, we're in this science of reading war, right? And we're talking about all those, we see a lot of schools that are in high poverty areas that teachers are coming in and well-meaning and they want to
Mhm.
work hard, but they don't necessarily, especially if they're emergency certified, have the literacy preparation to teach, K to 3. And I'm a former, and Mike is too, I'm a former first grade teacher,
So am
teaching
I.
literacy. Yeah. So we
So am
know
I.
that takes to teach kids how to read. And I hear stories about teachers that are using teachers pay teachers. And I'm not ripping on teachers pay
Mhm,
teachers, but
mhm, mhm.
are we really vetting the resources that we're using when we're using it with kids that need the highest quality resources? How does your work, because it's not just about your book, you just do an incredible amount of work. How does your work help address some of these issues for schools and for that policy that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I'm glad you lifted up the literacy piece on this, Peter, because that's one of my babies. I'm also a former first grade teacher, and it is difficult to teach reading,
Yes.
and I think folks think that it's an easy endeavor, but I see so many of our current sort of disparities starting right there at first grade, in particular with literacy. No disrespect to my folks who are big math folks, who are science, but reading is the fundamental sort of block for all of future learning. And you're right, we've had all these different, debates and reading wars sort of back and forth. At the end of the day, part of what I try to lift up in the book is that, look, there's a mound of evidence around some of the things that work when it comes to not just literacy instruction, numeracy instruction, other pieces. And one of the things I lift up, and I go through a number of studies, is the power and the utility of power, high dosage tutoring.
Mhm.
The idea that you have students who have individual time with instructional aides or classroom teachers in groups of no more than 2 or 3 at the most. And they work with them consistently 2 to 3 days a week, 30 to 45 minutes per session in a quiet, undistracted location, going over core fundamental skills, addressing them with consistency for 3, 4, 5 months. That's what's needed to help young people catch up. The data sort of backs that up. So part of the question becomes, where are our policies that mandate smaller class sizes, more instructional aids, dollars for enrichment, after school activities that are not high profile daycare settings, but really rooted in having kids get access to high dosage tutoring. I think part of what I say is that the equity now mantra is sort of rooted in the fact that we can't wait another 3 to 5 years to try to figure this out because we'll lose students in the process. And part of my contention is that we know that when it comes to issues around literacy and other academic disparities, that having highly trained, highly qualified teachers makes a big difference. I make that call, even though our teachers are really stretched and stressed beyond their own sort of willingness to acknowledge. But also, to this point on this format, leadership matters. We know that when there are strong, committed, once again, highly qualified leaders, that they can set a tone, they can advocate for resources, they can put supports in place to begin to create the kind of ecosystem where teachers can thrive. And when teachers thrive, that lifts up students' abilities to thrive. So I think for me, at the end of the day, what I've tried to say in this book is that everybody can play a role, whether you're a school board member, whether you're a parent or a caregiver, whether you're a paraprofessional, whether you're the data person at the district. Part of this is, how do we work sort of in sync to ensure that we're sort of advocating for the policies and practices, which we know what they are. This is not like a mystery of any sorts. There's tons of evidence that help us to understand what works for students who are behind. How do we just make sure that those things don't continue to fall further and further off the table of what we think can help our young people be the best that they can be?
Yeah, I remember on the last season, I interviewed somebody named Pamela Snow out of New Zealand, and she said some words that I guess it's common sense, but it really, for some reason, has stuck with me ever since. She said that literacy is a world health issue.
Hmm.
It is a human right that everybody should be able to have. And I go into that with, when you're running a workshop or you're coaching or something, when you can call literacy a world health issue, it just gives people a different lens.
Yeah, if I could just chime in on that, I think that
Yeah.
that's a powerful way of putting it. I mean, I've looked at data on folks who are incarcerated in our country, and one of the things that jumps out, something like 80% of all folks across the board, across race, ethnicity, gender, about 80% read below an 8th grade reading level. So it's clear when we get literacy right, we can address so many ails in our society.
For sure. You know, if I were to replay that last segment, Tyrone, I think you said the word rooted probably a half dozen times, and the word rooted means a lot to Peter and I as we do our work, and we talk about the word human interconnectedness, and we describe it to individuals as um, similar, like you're from California, so the redwood tree, and
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
their root
Hmm.
systems are shallow, but they're completely interconnected,
Yep.
and because they're interconnected, even though they have a shallow root system, they stand together in turbulent times, and we love that analogy. In terms, we just believe it's a stronger analogy than just using the word relationship. So let's go
Mhm.
down that path a little bit
Yep.
in terms of our audience that are here and want to hear a little bit more about engaging families and communities. And you suggest that engaging parents, families, and caregivers in schools is important. So discuss some of the practical strategies that educators can use to build that stronger equity center relationships with families and community.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I appreciate you lifting that up, Mike, because I'm big on the idea of how do we engage, not involve. I make a distinction between engaging families and parents and caregivers as opposed to just having them be involved. I think the involvement mantra says, come show up at school when we say show up, leave when we say leave, come on our conditions, come on our terms, and then everything will be fine. And I think engagement is a more robust way of thinking about it. I think that part of what we have to recognize is we have to help parents and caregivers see themselves as partners with us. And I'm very intentional and not just saying parents, but saying families and caregivers, because there's a lot of data on the number of young people being raised by grandparents. A report just came out just last week, this week, as a matter of fact, there's close to, I think, 3 million children who've been raised by grandparents that are reported. The number who have been raised by great grandparents has gone up over the past decades. It's just a mind-boggling reality. So we have to understand the dynamic nature of who are raising our students. But part of what I suggest is that there are things that are really powerful, and you all know this. For example, uh, all schools have, PTAs and PTOs. That's a really important sort of fundraising aspect of many schools and many districts. And many parents know about and are connected there. So I talk about that. But I think more importantly, here in California, we have school site councils or governing bodies. And those school site councils are really powerful because they are part of the decision-making process of core aspects of the school. They help to think about, how do we hire, who do we hire, where do our budget, how our budget gets approved. And rarely, and they have to have parents or caregivers on those committees. Now, frequently I've seen principals who are very intentional in hand selecting certain parents that they want to be on those committees because they need them, because they want them to rubber stamp what they want to do. I think we have to be more transparent and ask for those parents and caregivers who are perhaps more willing to be naysayers and ask harder questions and say, wait a minute, let's think twice about this. We have to give parents and caregivers more sort of, I would say, more powerful roles and not just superficial roles in how schools operate, because this is their greatest possession, their children that we're talking about here. So we have to think about that. There are other issues I put on the table, such as even how I continue to see districts send information home in one language, English, despite the fact that we have millions of young people in this school who come from homes where their parents and caregivers, their first language is not English. So you cut off a very vital mode of connecting to schools, which is communication, when you don't send information home in multiple languages. I think that's a huge way to tell parents and caregivers that they don't belong. And then the final thing I'd say to this, and perhaps this is the biggest one, is I think we've got to move past the mantra that parents who don't show up at schools, or caregivers who don't show up at schools don't care about their students. I just don't think I just think that's just so not the case, because we have to ask, why don't parents and caregivers show up? I think we have to recognize that many parents and caregivers had bad experiences when they were in school. So they see schools as this very sort of, hostile place in some cases. I think lots of parents and caregivers work multiple jobs, which makes it difficult for them to show up at schools. When we have back to school night at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that's back to school. That's back to school afternoon. Parents are working, right? I think we have to be creative. I think what we learned from the pandemic is that when we have access to technology, parents and caregivers can connect in a different way. Everybody doesn't have to show up at the school at 5 o'clock in the evening. If I can just log on from home and get access to all the information in multiple languages, that makes it more accessible. So part of what I continue to stress is that we also have to ask parents and caregivers for more. We need their investment, we need their time, we need their expertise. But I was thinking back to what my grandmother says, not always what you say, but how you say it. We have to be more inviting of those entities in and not blaming them for why they're not doing better jobs as parents. And I think we have to sort of walk this road very delicately, but I think it's a powerful part of how we make schools better.
See, and I think, and I 100% agree with you, which is not surprising, but I was recently doing some work with leadership teams in Arkansas and working with them over 6 days, over 3 months. And we go through collaborative inquiry and what's your main priority, what's your challenge, you're trying, the problem you're trying to solve, all that stuff. And one of the schools in the room actually said, parent accountability. And I said, that's a really interesting way to describe it. Could you tell me more? Because when
Right.
I hear accountability, it makes me think of that you don't think, I want to hear more. And they said, well, parents don't care about school like they used to when we were kids.
Mhm.
What they didn't know is that there was another school within the room. They're from the Excel Center, and I have no problem saying their name. They are a school in Little Rock that is for people who have dropped out of high school, and their age population is 19 to 72. And
Mm,
it's not a GED program. They were getting a full-on high school diploma. And they have a fantastic leadership team that I learned so much from being in that room with them. Even went
mhm.
to visit the school and everything. And one of the people from that school had no problem standing up very politely and said, "Please be careful when you say that parents don't care about their
Mhm.
child's education, because those families, those parents that you're talking about are our students, and
Wow.
they're working 2, 3 jobs, and they
Mhm.
don't know what questions to ask.
Mhm.
They care, but they don't know how to fit in
Right.
because some of them haven't fit in. They got a very clear message when they were K-12
That's right.
students
That's right.
that
That's right.
they weren't invited, and now we are trying to help them figure out how to fit in. And I gotta tell you, the whole dynamic of that team, of that whole like, all the teams in that room changed because of
Yeah.
that one conversation.
Wow.
So
That's
you're
powerful.
absolutely spot on with what you're saying. That whole idea that families don't care about their child's education is just wrong.
Mhm.
It's that
Mhm.
we need to invite them in and get that, and we need to understand how to make, just like Mike was talking about with the human interconnectedness part. How do we, and it goes back to your repair. How do
Mhm.
we repair with those families
That's right.
when some of them, when they were kids, were given a
That's right.
very clear message that they
That's
don't
right.
fit into our school?
That's
So
right. Agreed.
your book is just so powerful from that
I
standpoint.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Couple of questions before we let you go. You know, the whole idea, we're always talking about data driven and evidence based, and data is often mentioned in educational context, but your book recommends engaging with it in an equity based way. So how
Mhm.
can educators and policymakers use data effectively to identify priorities, which you've already said they know, they know,
Mhm. Mhm.
track progress, and ensure accountability in creating equitable learning environments?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is so basic, but yet we miss the mark on, is that we've got to do a better job helping teachers understand what data tells us and what data we're collecting. I go to schools all across the country, and I ask data questions about sort of what trends they've seen over time, and I get looks that are like just befuddling, or where have they seen any kind of regression with certain subgroups, or what core competencies. And so you tell me a kid is struggling in reading, that's a very broad concept. Is it around decoding? Is it around comprehension? Is it around sort of, sequencing? So I think part of what we have to do is we have to find better, I don't know, I would say better data systems, but we need to do a better job of helping to teach and explain to teachers the data that they're looking at, and how that should inform, how it could inform their instruction on a day-to-day basis. If I've got a student who's struggling with decimals, I shouldn't double down on teaching fractions. I've got to be able to look at this student struggling with decimals and say, okay, how do I put together an intervention based on the data I've gotten that shows me that 80% of my third graders are struggling with decimals? That helps me to know where my intervention and supports need to be in place. And I continue to kind of sort of march through my math curriculum business as usual. So it's understanding the different kinds of data that are being sort of at our disposal. The other thing I also suggest is that I lay this out, and I think I get too researchy in this, but I try not to, is that there are different types of data. And I think what we tend to do in schools is load up on the quantitative data, right? The numbers of the what, and the quantitative data matters. It tells us a picture of the what. But I maintain that we also have qualitative data that we're collecting every single day that's less formal, yet still powerful and still rich. When students tell us they don't want to be in schools and classrooms, that's data. When students are disruptive, that's data. When students are quote unquote misbehaving, that's data. I think when parents show up angry, that's data. I think we have to ask ourselves, what are all the multiple data points that are at our disposal, and how are then we responding in kind to make sure that those data points do not get ignored. I also think when it comes to certain data, we have to be very intentional, and you both know this, and you both do this well, around the disaggregation of data. Meaning, how do we do a deeper dive on subgroups that we know have been struggling? So we can't say as a school we've got a 90% graduation rate, which is great, But, again, sometimes the devil's in the details. If we've got a 90% graduation rate, but our students who have disabilities are graduating at a 50% rate, that should raise a red flag that we've got to do a better job of looking at that subgroup. Same thing with our students who are unhoused. Same thing with our students whose first language is not English. We have subgroups. In some cases, they are small in number, but yet still the percentages of how they're doing is not very important at all. And I also make this call to suggest, and I know this would never fly, but I'd still put it out there, is that, as a college professor, one of the things I appreciate is that at the end of a term, at the end of a semester, my students, they have the opportunity to anonymously evaluate me. And let me tell you, sometimes they do not hold back. They tell me all the things I missed the mark on, what I didn't do well, what I should have spent less time doing, less reading. And it's humbling to read that data, but it helps me to become a better teacher. I say, what if we were to do the same thing with high school students? At the end of a semester, at the end of an academic year, high school students have the opportunity to do evaluations of their teachers. Now, I know I get all kinds of pushback. Union people say, no, that would be used as weaponized against them. Students are not old enough to kind of, coherently explain. I disagree with that. I think students are very sort of, intellectually gifted to tell you what they like, what they don't like, who they want, who they don't want. I just think we have to begin to sort of utilize data in a much more dynamic way by using student voice and student perspectives and student opinions, along with the big data sets that are quantitative in terms of how we're doing with trends and where we're meeting standards and where we're below benchmark, et cetera. So the data chapter is one of my favorite because I think we can radically rethink how we understand data.
So all right, so the last question for you. So this season is actually focused on a learner's mindset.
Yes.
And just with the conversation we're having right now, and you had mentioned earlier about banning conversations, and that's something that, I certainly have focused on within this podcast, but we've focused on with another show you've been on that I'm a part of, which is a seat at the table for Education Week. And I find that these conversations about race and equity are challenging to people, but they're also the ones where I found the most growth as a learner because I thought I got it. I thought I was inclusive. And then I had conversations and realized, oh, I have a long way to go. So in your work over the past few years, what have you learned? What have you learned when you're doing all of this research or, as a college professor, but you have multiple roles that you're engaged in. Are there any key things that you've learned in these roles that you've taken away to be able that have kind of changed your perspective?
Oh, it's a great question, Peter. You hit me with the deep one at the end.
Oh, I wanted to warm you
uh,
up.
yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, I was given a talk about 10 years ago. I think it was in San Antonio, Texas. And you've done this before. I'm sure you and Mike then. You're getting ready to give the talk and they're doing all the other platitudes and you're kind of backstage. And there was a young man who was working the technology, had to be about mid-20s. And so he asked me, he said, what are you going to talk about? And I told him, I said, I'm going to give a talk about educational equity and opportunity. And so he very innocently said, how long you been doing this? And at the time, I think I'd been doing it about 20 years. Okay. He said, do you think it's making a difference? And I was just struck by his very flat, direct question. I don't think he asked it in a sarcastic way or skeptic. I think he asked in the best, most sincere of intention. And I paused and I said, wow, do I think it's making a difference? And I told him, I said, I have to believe that on some level it is, because if it weren't, I wouldn't be doing it. Now, the question becomes, and I told this young man, I said, sort of where the difference is being made. And I said, I can't answer that question. You have to ask the adults I've interacted with, the students I've interacted with. So I think about that interaction as I think about your question, Peter. And the thing that I think that I take away about this is that it's a really, we live in a very politically polarizing moment, as you both know. But I still believe that there is a deep seated desire amongst all people to get this thing called education right. I hear people, well-meaning people, well-intentioned people who show up every single day, who put in lots of hours for other people's children. And I don't think they enter these classrooms mean-spirited. I don't think they enter these schools with intent to harm. I think they really want to do right by young people. Now, let's be clear. Sometimes the best of intention can have disastrous effects. I get that. But I want to see how we can tap into that sense that we can do right by all children. And what I've learned over time is that if you want to begin to really do the work in a much more transformative way, you can't beat people up for trying. You can't push them out. This goes to the whole belonging mantra. It's about pulling people in. And what I found over the years is that having people talk about their own experiences, having people talk about when they've been othered, having people discuss when they've had their own insecurities and their own sort of life issues that have, impacted their educational opportunity, when they sort of start with their own lived realities, that becomes an opening to say, well, some of those realities that you experience, the students that you teach have very similar ones in this current moment. What did you need then? What did you want then? What do you wish an adult had said to you? Because you have an opportunity to do that same thing with students today. So what I found is that if you talk to Tyrone Howard 20 years ago, he was a much more angry and intentional, you got to get it right today person. And I think in doing that, I learned you push people away. And when you push people away, you don't bring the kind of change that you want to see. I think this Tyrone Howard now is a little wiser, a lot wiser, I'd say. And I think the message has changed in terms of we need all hands on deck. And we are seeing too many of our young people fall through proverbial massive cracks. And I think what I've learned is that when you begin to listen to students, hear teachers out, empower leaders, really centralize parents and caregivers, we can start to see some inroads, but it can't come from dividing people and tearing people down and telling people what they don't do or what they need to do better. It's recognizing that what folks are doing better and trying to build from there. So that's my long roundabout way of answering your question, Peter.
No, I gotta tell you, Tyrone, every time I talk to you, I love that person's question, but your words always impact me in a positive way. I feel like
I
it's a
appreciate that,
master
my friend.
class every time I get to talk to you.
I appreciate that, my friend.
So, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And, we can't thank you enough for being on the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
I can't thank you enough for the work you do, Peter. I tell people I know you when I'm out about that. I feel like I get cool points. I get street
And they
cred.
say, who's Peter DeWitt?
Not at all. Not at all. So thank you for making the impact you're making in schools across this country. Your name comes up more than you know. So your ears should be buzzing out there. Mike, it's great to meet you and thank you for what you're doing as well.
So, Mike, I know that you enjoyed, and by the way, great questions. I love how you kind of preface questions and go into it. And the thing about this season is really looking at the learner's mindsets, and I've certainly learned a lot from you. Um, and I just enjoyed what Tyrone was saying, and I think there's some important key nuggets there too. Like, you can't just call it parent involvement; it's got to be family engagement. That's something I started to look at when I wrote collaborative leadership too, because the family dynamic is changing, and also that whole assumption that if a family member isn't around or you don't see them, it doesn't mean they don't care about education. So that's something that I think we can easily address with some of the ideas that he gave, but also just I think we have to change our mindsets about the fact that if we don't see a family member, it automatically means that they don't care.
Yeah, absolutely. And back at you on the interview. It was a lot of fun. It's such Tyrone is such an easy person to talk to, and just I think it's one that I definitely want to go back to and listen to because I think I will learn at a much deeper level. And you're exactly right, Peter. That mindset of, for us as no matter where you are in education, listening to this, whether you're a teacher or a principal or school superintendent or a board member, um, this is for you. He makes his language and his thoughts accessible to everybody. And those Tyrone fans, which you and I are, we've said that in our opening, and it was pretty obvious throughout the interview. We are fans of him. He, in many different articles, he talks about, this new book is not for the faint of heart. And I had paused at that phrase. I looked it up, and even though I know what it means, I looked it up because I found my heart hurting a bit. But then listening to him, he says it in a way that gives hope. So he talks about, for us to have the courage to face difficult things, and but he does it in practical solutions. I thought it was just fantastic.
Yeah, well, it's a great first interview with my new co-hosts. I'm very excited about that. So this was a good one to start off with. But for our listeners, please feel free to give us feedback. Mike, I've had the luxury of being on the road, and I've had a lot of people come up to say how much they've enjoyed the podcast, and I'm sure this is going to be one that's going to be at the top of their list as well. So we're always encouraging feedback. We want to hear more from you. And Mike, I'm very excited to go on this new venture with us. Besides the co-authoring and the facilitating workshops and all that, now we are actually co-hosts of the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast, and I can't thank you enough for agreeing to be a part of it.
Well, it's great. I don't know, live with Peter and Mike, is that our new little phrase or something? Anyway, thank you very much.
We're not going to change the title, but yeah. So very excited. But Mike, good to see you, and to our listeners, we're very grateful that you've been listening to us.
Very grateful. Thank you.